So welcome everyone. I'm really glad that you joined us today for this dialogue with the authors. So today is October 13th, 2021, and we're here with Daniel George and Peter Whitehouse to discuss the book American Dementia, Brain Health in an Unhealthy Society. And I'm Alex Arnold. I'm the program director at the Taos Institute. Just a few words about what we do. The Taos Institute is an educational organization, a nonprofit. We're completely virtual, and yet we gather over 750 associates from around the world and many, many more followers who join us for workshops, conferences, courses, and we offer podcasts, video series. We have a publishing house as well. And all of this is really to promote social constructionist ideas and practices, because we believe that it's in the relational processes that we build the future together. So we're very excited to have you here, and I will let Daniel and Peter lead the conversation from here on. We'll break out into small groups, have some discussion, and I hope you enjoy our time together. Daniel, you can take it from here.
Yes, I think
Alex, So Danny and I, of course, have had over decades of relationship, and we closely coordinate who speaks first, and then forget, at least in my case, how we planned that. But thank you, Alex. So I'm proud to be a Taos associate, and the real purpose of this meeting is to recruit Danny to be a Taos associate. But in true Taos style, we're going to run this program around our book by starting to introduce each other rather than introducing ourselves. And then we'll give a short 20-minute presentation, followed by breakout sessions and large group discussion, as is often the custom in the Taos do author sessions. So Danny George is a remarkable man that, as I mentioned, I've had the opportunity to collaborate since he was an undergraduate. Our relationship actually goes back before that, because he went to the same high school as my daughters in Shaker Heights, Ohio. We got to know each other around our interest in the power of stories. And Danny is now an associate professor at Penn State University in the Department of Humanities in the medical school, and also a member of the Public Health Systems Department, I think is the name of it. And he is the first author of American Dementia, Brain Health in an Unhealthy Society, and was a co-author with me of our first book, The Myth of Alzheimer's, What You Aren't Being Told About Today's Most Dreaded Diagnosis. So we've been working together for a long while, playing together as well, I might add. So that's Danny George.
Thanks, Peter. And thanks everybody for being here today. I see a lot of familiar and friendly faces out there, including my mom. So I know I at least have one person in my corner, in addition to Peter, but it's really good to see everybody, and thank you for making the time today. So yes, Peter Whitehouse is a force to be reckoned with. Peter is a MD, PhD, as his primary appointment in neurology, but he has a laundry list of other academic appointments in psychiatry and cognitive sciences and neuroscience, organizational behavior. Peter stands in many realms. He is a connector of knowledge par excellence. He founded with his wife Kathy the intergenerational schools in Cleveland, which I was fortunate to study for my PhD research for several years in Cleveland. Peter was also earlier in his career responsible in part for the development of cholinesterase inhibitors, which are the drugs many people will know have been FDA approved for several decades. But he has evolved his thinking, his practice, his care for persons living with memory loss in ways that are really compelling and admirable, I think. And so I've been very lucky to fall into his orbit, and lucky to write 2 books and many other collaborations with him. So we're going to basically go free form today for the most part, and try to engage everybody in a hopefully an expansive discussion about brain health and dementia that is framed around social construction, but also gets into political economy and many other areas. And Peter is going to kick us off. And as he does that, I'll just post again the learning objectives for today in the chats to remind folks of that.
Thank you, Danny. Danny is PhD from Oxford was actually, the research was done in these intergenerational in Cleveland, where he demonstrated the quality of life enhancing capabilities of volunteering in intergenerational schools for older people with dementia. So this goes round and round, this topic of brain health in society, intergenerational relationships. And hello, Deborah, Danny's mom, who I of course know well. Yeah, so Danny's put in the chat the learning objectives, which you all received. But to foreshadow your engagement in about 20 minutes or 25 minutes after our talk, Danny's also going to post a question, which we're going to break out into groups where we'll all be talking about the same question, and then we'll bring that back to the common space and have a longer discussion around those breakout rooms. American Dementia, Brain Health in an Unhealthy Society. The chapter we gave you is entitled, it is the chapter that essentially talks about how Alzheimer's disease became socially constructed. And I can assure you it is still being socially reconstructed and in different ways. I'm as I sometimes say, I'm history, Danny's the future. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the past and bring us up to the modern day. And then Danny's going to talk about some of these very important social, public health and policy issues. So I think you're all aware it's an old term. Alzheimer used that, Dr. Alois Alzheimer used that term back in 1906, and his boss, the very influential psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin, made it a disease when he referred to it as such in his 1910 textbook. At that time, it was in the title of his paper, a peculiar rare disease. And over time, people have lumped these forms of illness that affect younger people with the more common forms of cognitive impairment, which is what defines dementia in a large number of older people. And we all know that there are more older people in the world, so that's a growing concern. The social construction that's going on at the moment is that the field is trying to define Alzheimer's disease purely biologically. Biomarkers. Now, some biomarkers like blood glucose or even hypertension or cholesterol may be a reasonable marker, but in the field, we've gone ahead of ourselves. Our markers are not adequately connected to the clinical situation that we find ourselves in. And by that, I mean that when the FDA approved the latest new drug, which many of us believe should never have been approved. The name of the drug is aducanumab. This molecule, this biologic, this antibody, was tied to a form of a protein involved in the process of Alzheimer's disease, one of many, that actually Alzheimer himself described. The amyloid is found inside the senile plaques that he looked at under the microscope, although he had no idea what the amyloid was. So it's one feature. And this medicine certainly removes amyloid from the brain of people with dementia. But that is not the goal, is it? It's not to change the biology, it's to help people. And there's precious little, I would say almost no clear evidence that this drug actually benefits people. So when you define a disease purely on the basis of biology and develop a treatment for the biology that somehow bypasses the fact that this is an illness that affects people, you've socially reconstructed a disease in very dramatic and I think dangerous ways. But that's what the industry would like. They would like to treat clearly measurable factors like brain amyloid as measured in a PET scan. That's a whole lot easier than trying to get into the individual lives of people and trying to figure out how to help them as individuals. The cholinesterase inhibitors, which I was involved in approving, I think aren't worth what we hoped they would be worth. And in fact, in France, they've been taken off the market, and in other places, people are not viewing them as significant in their effects, but they were approved scientifically using clinical measures, unlike aducanumab, the latest drug, which didn't really have adequate clinical data. So this is the history of how Alzheimer's has been socially constructed and reconstructed. And the big question there, as we'll get to, is power. Who gets to make the decision about how we call something an illness in society? Now, I'm about to pass it on to Danny to talk about the main bulk of the book, which is Brain Health in an Unhealthy Society. That was our working title for the book. And at the end, we added in 2 words in front of that, American Dementia. Now, that is a social construction. We are claiming in the book that we have a cultural construction, we have constructed dementia in a way that is demented, that we ourselves as human beings have a cultural cognitive impairment. And dementia is defined clinically as problems with memory, problems with planning, problems with perceiving things that affect activities of daily living. And I think we can all ask ourselves at this point in this history of our species, whether we have cognitive limitations in not only thinking about aging in the brain, but about things in general. We human beings have a tendency to forget the lessons of the past, one feature of dementia. We certainly are having a huge lot of problems planning for the future, another feature of dementia. And if you ask about the quality of our food and even our very conception of what waste is, nature doesn't have waste, human beings have waste, that we have our activities of daily living. So my most provocative comment at the end of my presentation is, hey, every one of us has to think more deeply about dementia, because right now we are not thinking in a way that is going to help people with dementia or ourselves. It's time to rehumanize ourselves and use dementia as a lever for changing civilizations in ways that make it friendlier for all of us, regardless of our cognitive abilities. So that then the question is, okay, if that's the history, if that's the social construction that we're trying to advocate for here, Danny, what's the evidence that if we work on the health of our society, that will impact on brain health?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. And before I get to that point, I think Peter did a great job of framing the history of Alzheimer's to this point. But let me just add one other piece to that story, which in the 1970s, the National Institute of Aging was created under the leadership of Dr. Bob Butler, who many may know. He was a sort of renowned geriatrician. And I'm just going to paste one quote that's very famously linked with Dr. Butler, whose job was basically to make the Institutes of Aging competitive within this marketplace of other public health organizations that exist in the country. And in terms of the social construction, he made a very conscious decision to create a narrative that he called the Politics of Anguish. And this is sort of strategy that emphasizes the tragedy of Alzheimer's, that emphasizes the loss, the gravid consequences of aging and the effects that has not just on people who are affected, but caregivers and whatnot. So that created a sort of cultural script that still dominates today in the way we conceive of Alzheimer's. And it also establishes Alzheimer's, as Peter is saying, is something that's discretely separate from brain aging, which is a very problematic split in the way we've constructed our understanding, because there are intimate overlaps that we can speak to more as we go on. But basically the project to establish Alzheimer's as a discrete disease was much more of a political project than a scientifically rational one. So we're still kind of feeling the effects of that today. But what are the modern hallmarks of this narrative, the narrative of Alzheimer's? Well, people will be familiar with this idea that we have a tidal wave of dementia coming in Western countries. In wealthy Western nations, we have the silver tsunami that's going to bankrupt us if we don't come up with a cure for Alzheimer's disease. And that's been sort of the cultural script that we all have been conditioned to. And as Peter's saying, the idea has been, if we throw enough money into this process, if we give it enough time, it will yield a cure. And I'm going to go ahead and just show a few slides here. Hopefully this screen share will work, because that narrative has been challenged of late. And Alex and Peter, please let me know if, let's see if think I'll need to swap again.
Yes.
Is that better, Alex?
Well done.
Okay. So this idea of a tidal wave of dementia has been challenged by this recent finding, which has emerged in the last decade, which is that in the United States and in 5 other Western European countries that you can see here, dementia rates have actually been falling over the last several decades. So since the 1980s, there's actually been a 13% reduction per decade for risk of developing dementia in these countries. Specific to Alzheimer's, there's been a 16% reduction per decade since the 1980s. In other words, if you turned 65 or older in the 2010s, your risk for developing dementia was 13% lower than somebody who turned 65 in the 2000s. So we've been seeing this diminishing risk at the population level, which really contradicts or contravenes against this dominant narrative about the sort of Alzheimer's tsunami. So what is going on? So when they pool the data from these countries and look at all of the aggregated statistics, there are 2 main features that seem to emerge from these studies. One being the countries have done a better job of preventing and treating vascular disease, which is a major risk factor for brain aging and dementia. And 2, there's been increased access to high school and higher education in almost every country, which is something I'll speak about earlier. But let's put this in this data in historical cultural contexts. And this is where we're going to shift from social construction to political economy. So what happened in the mid 20th century? Well, everybody's familiar with the 2 world wars and the Great Depression, and the sort of state response to those traumas was to establish social democracies in Western countries. These were basically within the context of capitalism, but kind of based on Keynesian economic theory, which is the idea that you need to limit and restrain capital flows across nations, that you need to support workers and have strong unions and collective bargaining, and that the role of the state is really to keep unemployment low, to create jobs, to regulate the industrial and environment sectors, to bust trusts, and to use progressive taxation to redistribute wealth within a country to preserve a robust welfare state and a robust middle class. And that was the economic model that took hold through most of the 20th century. And of course, in the United States, we had kind of a resurgence of the middle class, and that sort of look back on very fondly in retrospect. So what happened during this era specific to brain health? Well, one, in the United States, we had the Great Society and we had Medicare and Medicaid emerge, but in the other 5 countries in Western Europe, they implemented national healthcare systems. What that means is that more people, millions and millions of more people who are now in their aging years, got lifespan care for things like hypertension and diabetes and high cholesterol, things that affect the health of the vascular system and therefore the health of the brain. So that was a major input for brain health. Another one is that there were highly successful public health campaigns aimed at smoking cessation. So in the United States, we had several federal acts that put taxes on cigarettes and banned particular advertising methods from the industry. And that has resulted, not just in the US, but in other countries, in a dramatic drop in smoking rates. So in the United States, we had 42% of the population smoking in the 60s. Now it's down to about 14%. And it's a specific downstream result of the major investments that were made in the mid 20th century to get people to stop smoking. And that, of course, correlates with improvements in vascular health as well. A few friends out there today are in Cleveland, and I'll give you all a shout out. But one funny story that we love to joke about in Cleveland, because we're a self-deprecating people, is that in the late 60s, our river had pollutants in it, and a flotilla of contaminants caught on fire in 1968. And that spawned the birth of the Environmental Protection Agency. And under the Clean Air Act in the 1970s and 80s, the EPA was able to de-lead gasoline. And lead, of course, is a known neurotoxin. It also puts people at higher risk for heart attacks and vascular disease, strokes and otherwise. And so de-leading gasoline dropped the blood lead levels in the United States a full 80% from 1970 to 1990. And so reducing that environmental burden is another major input that it has likely improved brain health for people who are now entering their graying years. And then the last point that I'll talk about, which has been found in these studies that I mentioned, is increased access to formal and informal education. And obviously, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's, again, a result of particular political economic decisions that were made in the mid-20th century. So we had tens of millions of soldiers coming back from World War II, and the GI Bill was implemented in order to provide subsidized higher education. 10 million World War II vets took advantage of that, got access to the protective resource of higher education. Of course, that was not shared equally across the culture because we still had segregated universities and colleges in that era. However, millions of more people were able to access higher education. The Cold War further expanded state investments in public universities. My grandfather, my mom's dad, was subsidized to learn Russian in the military out in California back in the 50s. And of course, we had Pell Grants emerge in the 1970s, which provided college access to millions more disadvantaged Americans. So we're just growing this pool of higher education. And we can get into this a little bit later, but there's a concept in brain health called cognitive reserve, which is the idea that if you challenge your brain, if you put yourself in novel learning circumstances across the course of your life, your brain is more resilient to age-related pathologies that happen to all of us as we age. And so people who get higher education potentially build greater cognitive reserve. And we're seeing that on a population level in the United States and these 6 countries that saw fit to invest in their higher education infrastructure. So that all emerged from the crisis of the Great Depression and the World Wars. But in the 1970s, as many will remember, we had a similar crisis of stagflation and the oil shocks. And that basically sowed the seeds for a new restructuring of our political economy based around more radical free market principles to try to jumpstart the economy, break unions, and what people perceived at the time as a sort of stagnation in our economic order. And so we had this restructuring around neoliberalism, or hypercapitalism, as people call it. And this is, in contrast to social democracy, predicated on the idea of capital mobility. So moving goods and capital and money across national borders. We know this as globalization. Instead of regulating industry, deregulating industries. We all know what happened with the housing industry, last decade with the Great Recession downstream from deregulations that happened in the 1990s in the Clinton administration, deregulating environmental controls. We know what happened in Flint, Michigan, and with the lead crisis that we're all dealing with in our communities now. There was also an emphasis on decreasing taxation on the wealthy and therefore defunding social programs and privatizing services and goods. And then, as I mentioned, attacking unions, which were seen as inefficient in a more kind of hyper marketized environment. And so neoliberalism has produced enormous wealth, the greatest wealth in the history of the world, but also record inequality. We all know the statistics about the 1% owning more than 50% of the rest of us. It's also produced volatile markets. The housing crisis I mentioned earlier is a direct result of the deregulations and the suspensions of New Deal era protections on banking and bank loan practices. And we've seen massive job loss as a result of tens of millions of industrial and manufacturing jobs being shipped to Mexico and to other countries with cheaper labor bases and non-unionized workforces. So that, in a nutshell, has been the sort of restructuring that we've all dealt with. Neoliberalism is the water that we swim in now. It's sort of it has shaped all of our lives over the last 50 years. So how is that pertinent to brain health? Well, we mentioned vascular health and its critical role in brain health. The brain is an organ that requires 20% of the heart's output to provide oxygen and nutrients. And so the two systems are intimately intertwined. And what we're seeing now in this neoliberal era is that 6 in 10 Americans, according to the CDC, have chronic disease. So whereas we saw massive gains in vascular health throughout the 20th century, as a result of the investments that I referred to, we're now seeing many people carrying not just one, but multiple chronic diseases, which put them at greater risk for poor vascular health and brain health. 80 million underinsured in this country. Again, those are people who are not getting frontline care to manage vascular and other risk factors relevant to brain health. We've seen stagnant wages for the last 40 years for people in low and middle income jobs. That's elevated precariousness and anxiety and despair in people's lives. One thing that I study at Penn State is deaths of despair. And we're seeing 160,000 of deaths from suicide, alcoholism, and drug overdose annually in this country, which are directly related to disinvestments in manufacturing and mining, all the jobs that were shipped out to other countries in the late 20th century. We're seeing falling lifespans as a result of this reordering. We lost a whole year and a half of life expectancy last year, but before that, 4 of the 5 last years, we saw falling life expectancy in this country as well. Again, total opposite of the 20th century, where we saw consistently rising lifespans. And of course, I mentioned the lead crisis, and you can see Mona Hanna Atisha here in the upper right. She's the pediatrician in Flint who exposed the crisis in that city. And Flint is an interesting case study intertwined with neoliberalism. In the 50s, they had 80,000 manufacturing jobs in Flint. And as a result of all of the outsourcing of jobs, they're now below 8,000 jobs. And so a decision was made by an emergency manager, somebody whose job it was to cut the budget in Flint, to change the water supply from Lake Huron to the Flint River. That led to more corrosive water entering the pipes, and obviously precipitating the lead crisis there. There were massive cuts to the environmental regulation state group that was supposed to oversee that. They fumbled on looking at water samples in Flint, and we have had ourselves a massive crisis in that country, or in that city. But there's lead in drinking water in cities across the country, even more than Flint. In Cleveland, where Peter and I obviously both hail from, the lead levels have been higher than in Flint, for instance. And then on the education side, whereas we saw consistently rising rates of higher education throughout most of the 20th century, we're now starting to see a dip in those rates and falling total years of higher education for the cohorts who are now turning 65 or older. That's obviously due to things like the rising cost of college, underwritten by Wall Street. Obviously, students have to take out massive amounts of debt now. We've marketized that industry, and we're starting to see the downstream effects of that. So more people will be moving forward without that protective brain health resource. And then just lastly, I want to allude to a more hopeful message, which is that research has also shown that about 40% of risk for dementia is modifiable at the individual level. So you can see in the white boxes in the middle there, all of the things that research has shown to be preventative and the things that we can modify. This is treating vascular risk factors, exercising, reducing alcohol and substance abuse issues, treating hearing impairments, maintaining social contacts and social connections, which is something we'll get into in the latter parts of this talk. But in terms of the social construction of this story, what Peter and I want to emphasize and kind of suggest to all of you is that what the thrust of this book is not what we can do at the individual level. This isn't a book about that. This is not a self-help book. It's what we call an other health book. We sort of say tongue in cheek, but we really want to talk about how can we construct a society that reduces risk for people at the level of the collective, at the level of public health and public policy. How can we ensure that as many people as possible are moving forward with healthier brains, healthier bodies, healthier lives? And we've really gotten away from that over the past several decades. And so I will pause at that point and hand off to Peter. And I believe the goal is to first take questions from folks before we head into the breakout room. Is that right, Peter? You're muted, Peter.
Yes, absolutely, Danny. And I will take it when you're ready, because I wanted to just reinforce two of the messages that you said. So prepare a few questions of clarification. Obviously, there'll be lots of times for questions in the breakout groups to follow in about 5 or 10 minutes. Danny mentioned the story of Robert Butler, who actually was one of my mentors. I was entering the field right at the time he was directing the National Institute of Aging. He actually came to regret later in his life that he had sold this as a single disease and sold a more medical approach than he wished. So if there's one message from those stories, it's that Alzheimer's disease is not a singular noun, it's heterogeneous. So the myth of Alzheimer's is that it's one thing. And I think we've both made that point. And the other is a plug before Alex does it at the end of the talk. Education is key. We love our intergenerational schools in Cleveland because they're relational based, they're appreciative, and they're reconstructing education. But do come to the upcoming relational education conference, the Taos. As a neurologist, I will certify your brain health is better if you attend that meeting. But let's see if there are any clarifying questions about what either Danny or I have said. And Danny and I will float around the breakout rooms and be available to answer any questions that might emerge there. But anything that we've said that you think should be clarified for the group? I want to just respond to one question from Sandy that's actually in the chat, because I almost made this point. I just attended, she's from Canada. I had just attended Baycrest in Toronto's Grand Rounds about brain health, and they are one of the world leaders and one of the leaders in Canada around brain health. But the talk was all about how their new brain health center is going to involve individuals. And when I asked the speaker, where does she think public health fits in, she kind of said, well, that's the government. I wish the government would do something. And I guess the message of Danny and our book, whether you're in Canada or elsewhere, is we are the citizens that can do something about what the government prioritizes. This is not just an American dementia. Canada's caught it, Europe's caught it, and I'm not saying we originated it, but unfortunately, America is kind of leading this rather a damaging message about brain health, that it's something simple that can be fixed with a pill. I just scanned a couple of the recorded version will be available. Anything else that's not in the chat that somebody would like to come on stage and just ask a question, or are we ready to go to breakouts?
Peter, I can jump in. If I'm pronouncing this right, sorry if I mispronounce it. Lana asked a question about whether there's evidence in if there's less Alzheimer's disease in societies where there's a more valued role for elders. And I will say there's not specific evidence for that. However, if you look at the Blue Zone project, which people may be familiar with, these are areas that have high prevalence of centenarians or super centenarians, people who live past 100. One of the common traits in those communities is that elders are a valued part of the community. They're not warehoused in separate institutions, for instance. They are integrated into the life of those communities. So places like Okinawa, Japan, or wherever the case studies in those blue zones have established that sort of intergenerational relationships are a common feature. And I was glad to see Matt Kaplan pop up. He's a colleague at State College at Penn State, who's a international expert on intergenerational relationships. So yeah, that's an absolute feature of blue zones.
And I see on the phone is Ken Nishikawa, who's in Kobe. And Matt and I were together virtually, and we've been there personally because Japan is a place where they have programs to revere elders, and one of the original blue zones was found. So I think those are the kinds of really important questions, Ilana, that it's just hard to come up with, evidence for. But to me, it's one of those things that's almost self-evident, that intergenerational relationships and respect for elders and respect for kids, which is something we're not doing well enough in this society at the moment with climate crisis and the like, they're really essential, just hard to measure. So Ken, Matt, if you wanted to respond to our comments, please do. Otherwise, we'll be moving to breakouts pretty shortly.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for mention to Japanese situation. Yes, yes. Everybody knows ikigai is a kind of interesting practice for senior generation. Actually, I'm 65. So, but in Japan, almost all kids in senior generation. Oh boy, everybody say, oh boy, yeah, beginning of senior generation. So how did we, the ikigai practice work in Japan, in Japanese situation? But so actually, so we love to practice habitually ikigai practice. So in that sense, so I would say, so social practice is a key essence for the chronic disease happening in the senior generation. That's my comment.
Matt.
I would like to just share a thought. So I spent a year in Japan looking at intergenerational programs, 1994 to 95. And the stereotype I had was the respect for elders, people would bow, everything was perfect. And I think we have so much to learn in that, around the world in terms of that orientation. However, I haven't seen a culture yet where it's not a struggle for, I guess, preventing ageism and so on. I did interview a bunch of older adults in Japan at the time. One person said, look, we have a program, the middle schoolers come to our assisted living facility, they bow to us, which is a sign of respect. However, they don't really listen to our stories. And also, they're so respectful. What's wrong with kids today? We used to be knuckleheads, we used to play and so on. So he wanted to have some unstructured time, some real, just time to dig deeply where people care about each other. So how do we recreate that? And you look at, post-industrial society, quick tea and so on, green tea. So a lot of traditions that, in rural areas, let's say tea ceremony and so on, there are some efforts to restore that in Japan in rural areas, which help people find time and opportunity, family to spend time together as opposed to putting some coin in a machine and getting a quick frozen green tea. So I think Japan's a great case of cultural introspection and looking at ways to maintain deep connections. So at any rate, Ken, I just wanted to share that, my respect for your society. Thank you.
One that I share, having spent some time there as well. So I think, Danny, we're ready to go to breakouts. Maybe it would be helpful if you put the question so it's at the bottom of the stack, so to speak, in the chat room. Alex is going to take care of that. We're going to randomly assign you. We're going to create about 4 groups. We'll ask you in good Taoist fashion to self-organize and have at least one person or one person or more, whatever you want to do, be available to share a few points that your group came up with answering the question. And of course, in typical Taoist fashion, if you want to talk about something else and come back and create a revolution, that's okay too. But we will give you about 20 minutes in the breakout. So that's lots of time for discussion, and we'll have time to share. And whatever time we have left over at the end, we'll have for a general discussion. Any comments, questions? Are we all set with that, including, most importantly, Alex?
Yeah, we're ready to go. So there will be 5 rooms, 4 people per room, and we'll give you about 20 minutes, like Peter said. So we'll send you a minute message when it's time to wrap up. So enjoy your conversations.
Welcome back, everybody. I didn't float. I think it's better to have an intensive conversation for 20 minutes than have, so I'm looking forward to hearing what the other groups did. So we all addressed the same question. So hopefully you got organized enough that there's some report back, whether it's a chorus or whether it's a solo voice. That was up to the group. But Alex, do we just want to do it in order? Starting with group 1.
We didn't label the groups, so I think anyone who wants to start is
All righty,
fine.
very good. So who wants to jump into this sharing space first?
Maybe I can break the ice. Yes, I made part of group 5, and I can't make a synthesis of all that we answer or all of things that we discuss around the question. So I will ask for help for David and Shaminlin, please. But I can talk about the first thing, that we don't like the question, because how to improve brain health. And we discuss that it will be better to think not in the organ or not in the brain, but in our health as people, as a system, and as a system linked with other systems, environment, and all things that make very good to the heart, very good to our liver, are very good to our brain. So we change the question, okay? Now I pass to Xiaominlin to share other idea of our discussion.
Thank you, Leonard. Yes, that's indeed what we talk about. And one other thing we talk about is at the individual level and societal level. And I'm from Taiwan, and right now this year I'm on a research leave with Georgetown here in DC. And I live in both societies, and it's extremely different in terms of healthcare. And in Taiwan, it's easy, and we talk about where Leonard come from, Portugal. We have easily accessible national healthcare plan system. Everyone can it's extremely affordable and easily accessible. So that's what we think is very important. And we also talk about in terms of the question, the brain health. I share a story about the adult day centers where I've been doing my ethnographic field work. Quite a few older adults, younger adults with vascular dementia, and they share similar stories. They have like minor strokes in earlier years in their life, and they never knew. And when later in their life they found something wrong, and they went and see doctors. After all the tests, then they know that they were told they had minor strokes in earlier years. So we talk about how to, in terms of public health, how to make the general public understand that what are the risk signs of strokes and other signs, and that's very important. So two things: public health issues about knowledge about strokes, and then easily accessible healthcare system. Yeah, and if David or other groups want to jump in, that's.
I don't have much to add. Thanks to my colleagues there. We talked about awareness, and it was great to learn about other countries. But like I'm in South Africa here, and not everybody has access to national health care. So the question was which was not answered because of time. How do we live with people with dementia? How do we take care of them. And if we are to go to broader society, in terms of advocacy, what can we do to raise awareness about that? So the greatest thing is how do we live and take care of people with dementia, and advocacy. Thanks. And thanks to my
Sorry, I actually lost my connection for a minute. Do we have other groups that would like to offer something, or individuals? Or am I Dan, Alex, can you hear me?
Yes, we
Yes.
can hear you, Peter. Thanks.
Anybody else? Sorry, we're coming. We have about a little over 15 minutes left, and if there's time, we'll have some reflections on the whole on each report. But anybody else, please?
I'd like to nominate Robin to talk about our group.
And I nominate Susan to talk about our group. So there you go. Now there's process at work.
Oh, thank you, Deborah. Yeah, so I had the privilege of speaking with Deborah and also with Matt Kaplan. And we took it from a number of perspectives. I mean, we just shared a little bit about who we are and how, we're connected here. And one of the themes was intergenerational and also giving voice to people and creating conversations at community level. So that kind of environment, that setting up that kind of framework is relevant for the topic here. And and it was so interesting. I mean, one of the things that Deborah brought home and made it very meaningful to me is about the ongoing desire to be relevant and a contributor in society. So post-retirement, what happens, or once you don't have meaning in your life, or the identity that you had when you were engaged working, how does that continue, and how can we create that in the collective, so that there's this sense of, what do I do now that I am participating actively in the society? So there was that aspect. There was also this notion that ageism does hold us back. There is this, this perspective that people have perhaps less patience, less willingness to engage with older people in the community. So we were more on the community connection, relationship aspect, rather than talking about the actual question itself in dealing with dementia and Alzheimer's. What about Matt or Deborah, if you'd like to chime in to add to that?
I was particularly struck with Matt's experience in trying to create intergenerational involvement in community building, and how I had mentioned in the group, we elderly or emerging elderly don't just want to talk about our histories. We don't want to just tell our personal story. We want to be relevant and influential in what's going on in our communities now. And Matt, I thought what you said was really important in terms of just having people stand up at a microphone and tell their story, young or old, preteen or older, was not the way you really have been able to get at real involvement. I think it would be good if you talked with the group a little bit about that. You're muted.
The best thing about our group is that I learned all about Danny's history. I'm going to write a book about Danny now. But yes, I mean, we talked about the importance of connection, and that like giving voice to all, particularly, people who are from another group, be it immigrants or refugees, or people of a different age group or different culture. So, and that's not easy. So we need to be creative. So in the community work I was sharing, we talked about having people do murals together an intergenerational community visioning type of project. So the method has to be appropriate developmentally for all of the participants. And you have to start with, we talked about starting with icebreakers, no judgment, lots of fun, getting to know one another. And once the relationships start kicking in, that's when you see all the benefits of self-esteem, more connectedness, more of a feeling of community and so on. So it's not easy though to get it started when there are stereotypes associated with the other. In this case, we talked about ageism. Thank you.
And yet we know that from the work Peter and Danny have done, that being part of a community is both preventative and also it's therapeutic for people who have already moved into a dementia mode. So, I mean, I think it's incumbent on us to figure this out.
Next.
Danny, why don't you take control, which is impossible with this group, but why don't you walk us out as facilitator here rather than me? And don't forget to leave time for Alex to announce that conference that's coming up.
I think everybody now wants to hear all the secrets from my past from my mom. I think that she stole the show.
I made that up. She did not divulge anything. Yeah.
No, it's great. It's great to see everybody. But yeah, I don't think all the groups have reported out yet. So are there others who might want to share?
I can share for group 2. So we went from personal experiences with parents facing dementia or facing the phase in life when they're in homes and the isolation they experience, and our concern that we have for parents and family members, and trying to understand what we can do, to a larger planetary vision that talked about the noosphere, which is a theory developed by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who was a Jesuit priest and scientist. And there are films that have been created about this accelerating planetary mind with the Human Energy Project and the noosphere. And I think Peter put this into the discussion. There's also ways of improving our relationships, not just amongst people, but with walks in the forest and nature bathing, I think is what a lot of people are calling that, to increase our interactions with nature. And also I spoke about developing research and pedagogies. So for instance, I made a film using stories of resiliency with women at the age of retirement and made a public happening out of that at our cantonal library with roundtable discussion and a film showing, an avant-premiere film showing, and recently incorporating transformative pedagogies that I call transformograms into higher education to generate narrative coherency, and understanding how narrative coherency that Dr. Siegel speaks about can really improve brain plasticity. And I would say that the noosphere films are also working on this narrative coherency with a new story or a new cosmology for the entire planet, which then can hopefully act on, I think, what was brought up, Daniel, in your presentation of the social and cultural determinants of health and public health, and the importance of a systemic vision that supports all chronic diseases, including Alzheimer's, but gives us another lens. So that's what we talked about. Maybe somebody else in the group would like to add something that I missed.
Only that we said we would mention trees and forests in our report. So we talked about them. The connections to nature really key in this time of climate crisis.
One thing that I want to say about the nature and the self. So traditionally, culturally, Japanese think about the self is not the independent being. So it's a relational being between nature and self. So always moving between nature and self. And probably some point of the idea help us manage well the socially healthy practice. So I think that only things, small things, but generally society understand so small but long-term traditional interrelational self is valued in terms of health. So that's my feeling from today's presentation. Thank you.
I think just a quick recap. We're group one, right? And group one can jump in at any time. We talked about basically the need for a different and emerging language, right? I think somebody had shared even her experience with a family member on how do you talk about these things. And I think the new language has to emerge at social levels, right? Part of what I research is how do we speak against the narrative of that person isn't there anymore? And how do we reorder society in a way that allows for more intergenerational care than it does and make it something that is valued? That's kind of the nutshell of our 20-minute conversation, but I know other people probably had different experiences. Definitely would like them to chime in if they can.
Danny, I see Nancy and her companion are illuminated but not speaking. Are you, Nancy Smith, are you trying to join in?
No, I had thought of something, but I am not always particularly articulate in these settings, so I thought I would do a better job of listening.
I can chime in here, but it has nothing to do whatsoever with the breakout session. But I did want to ask the authors about the impact of social media on brain health and brain aging as well. I'm hearing that social media is making us all a lot dumber and less able to critically analyze things and use critical thinking. And I'm wondering if either of the two authors have studied any of that or looked at any of the studies or could comment on that.
Yeah, thanks, Joe and Nancy. It's great to see you both. Friends of ours from Cleveland who've relocated now. But yeah, I think just to connect your question, Joe, to some of the comments from other people, when we talk about neoliberalism, this very clunky term, what it boils down to is a sort of re-entrenchment of liberalism. And what is liberalism? It's the idea that we're all individuals with discrete rights. But what neoliberalism does is say we're all individuals within markets. And so that's shaped a particular way of being in the world for us, where it's bred alienation from one another. It's made us feel like individual consumers. And in fact, the chapter that we gave everybody is all about this marketplace of memory products that is tailored to individuals and promises you salvation through self-care if you just take supplements and nutraceuticals or play this digital video game, you will save your discrete brain. And I was glad to hear some groups pushing back against that reductiveness. But specific to social media, I see that very much as part of like a natural extension of the neoliberal era, because we are all not just atomized individuals, but we're atomized individuals in front of screens perpetually. And that is very alienating and disenchanting, and it fractures reality for people, because as you're saying, Joe, the what's true is filtered through the different ecosystem in the media that people are plugged into. So if you're in your Facebook network, the algorithms will learn what you like and what you click on, and that becomes your reality. Sort of the algorithms know us better than we know ourselves. So it's a very troubling environment that we're living in right now. And in terms of brain health, yeah, absolutely. I mean, what social media does, whether it's Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, is you have this constant stream of stimuli that doesn't foster deep engagement, deep learning. So cognitively, it's sort of like junk food. You're just perpetually stimulated, which is definitely not good. And of course, the major problem is that it keeps us from forming those thick bonds in relation to other people in an embodied way. It's very easy to withdraw, and like anxiety and depression rates are up threefold just during COVID alone. And part of that is because of this massive social media use, people just interacting on screens and feeling alienated from one another. So yeah, we're in a tough environment. And I think all of us in our own way are struggling to figure out, how do we extricate ourselves from digital screens that we're imprisoned by constantly, and how can we sort of get back to the thick protective relationships that we know are good for us and good for communities.
Thank you, Danny.
And yet here we are on Zoom, and thanks for that. I really am grateful for that.
I was just thinking that.
Some irony.
And if you haven't noticed, I encourage all of you to share contact information in the chat. We're not able to send a full list to everyone, but please share in the chat. Many of you already have.
And I said in the chat, I made some comments. I said, you can't hug on Zoom, but this is my effort to hug you all, because I think this is an exceptional group in terms of trying to create spirit online. And I thank Danny for that comment. And we have a couple minutes left, so maybe it's time for us to think about any last words of wisdom. But my last words of wisdom is we should turn it over to Alex to tell you about this wonderful conference coming up.
Yes, so you may have heard, and Peter mentioned it earlier, so the Taos Institute is hosting a conference, Education as Relating. So that is November 4th, 5th, and 6th. It is a virtual conference, and really everyone is invited, from educators to parents to students. We're really hoping to give many voices and bring many voices in the room and engage in conversation to shape the future of education and really emphasize the benefits of these relational practices. We have a very fun, exciting video coming out in the next few days, hopefully, where we were able to interview some children in a school in Denmark that are really practicing some very engaging, inspiring things that they're doing. So if you see an email or on our social media, we do use that as well. Please share and help us spread the word. So I will put the link of our webpage in the chat. And Danny and Peter, if you want to say just last few words to wrap up, then we will part ways.
To you, Danny, last words.
Sure. Well, thanks everybody. Again, it's really heartening to see familiar faces, even if we're on digital screens. I can't wait to see you all in person. If people want to learn more, we do have a website for the book, AmericanDementia.com, and Peter and I are also on Facebook at The Myth of Alzheimer's. If you search for us there, we can extend the conversation in those spaces, reluctantly, because we wish we could do it in person, but we'll take the next best thing. And please do stay in touch. It's been a great conversation. And Alex, thank you and the Taos Institute for having us.
Thank you all so much for joining. It's always inspiring to be together, and the recording will be on YouTube for those who haven't been able to to stay with us. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.